Hi, I'm Lisa Ireland. I'm the author of The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan. In honour of Mother's Day, I thought I would talk to you today about my mum and the role she played in inspiring the story of The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan. But before I go ahead and do that, I guess I better tell you a little bit about the book itself. So, The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan centres around Shirley, who's 79. Shirley lives in Sydney with her daughter Fiona, and her husband Frank lives nearby in a nursing home because he is suffering from Alzheimer's disease. Now, Shirley has decided that the home is not doing Frank any good. She feels he would be better off with her, and Fiona disagrees. She can't really get Fiona to see her point of view, and so she decides that she will just take Frank from the home. She spends quite some time hatching this plan, and the novel opens with her really in the midst of carrying out that plan. So she takes Frank and they head off on a trip of a lifetime, really, which involves a combi van and a tour along the south coast of New South Wales and into the coast of Victoria. Along the way, they visit a few places that have quite large significance for Frank. For instance, they go through Gippsland, parts of Gippsland, including Lindenau, where Frank grew up. And Shirley is hoping that by doing this, that some of Frank's memories will be jogged. And she's also hoping, by giving him this trip that he's always wanted to do with her in a combi van, and for one reason or another they've never managed to do in their 50 odd years of married life, she hopes that she can atone for the secret that she's been keeping from him for decades. So that's the premise, that's the basis of the story. It's this elderly couple on a road trip trying to escape the law and their daughter. But it's actually a dual timeline story, which the backstory begins in the 1960s, and that is in 1961, in fact, when Frank and Shirley meet, by chance, at a beach in Victoria called Bankura Beach, near where Shirley lives. Shirley grew up in Geelong in Victoria, and they both happen to be at this beach on this particular day. A chance meeting ensues, and that's the beginning of their love story. So the two timelines are interwoven. We alternate between the two timelines until the climax of the book, where they both meet up. So that's pretty much the story in a nutshell. And how I came to tell it was, my mum actually influenced both the present day and the past timeline, the present day only in a very slight way. But my mum was actually known in her lifetime for being chronically late. I'm a very punctual person. This nearly drove me bananas. So I would often, when I was taking her somewhere, to a medical appointment or something, I would often lie and say that the appointment was half an hour earlier than it actually was, to make sure that we got there on time. So on one such occasion, I was at Mum's house waiting for her to get ready, and I was flicking through the newspaper to pass the time, and I came across this article about an elderly couple, octogenarians they were actually. I think they were in America. I think this story took place in America, and I've never been able to verify it. For many years since I read this story, I've been trying to chase it down and find out the names of the people, but I've been unable to. Anyway, it was the story of this elderly couple who escaped from their nursing home and went on the run from the law for several days. Now, the most entertaining thing about this story is that while they were on the run, they were actually captured by the police at one point and taken into custody. And the woman somehow managed to talk her way out of it, managed to get the particular police that were holding them to believe it was a case of mistaken identity, and they gave them the slip again and went on the run again, leaving these police very red-faced when when the story came out that they'd already been in custody. I was really fascinated by this story. I started to think about it and think what a great book it would make. at least a decade ago, well actually probably more like 15 years ago, that I first read that story in the newspaper. So I had it ticking away in the back of my head for years. I tried to write a short story once for an anthology that I was working on, and I couldn't make it work as a short story because I knew that there was more to the story than that short format would allow me to delve into. So I just kept this story at the back of my head, and thinking one day the opportunity will come up, and I'll be able to write it. So about 2 years ago, my house was flooded. We were hit by a storm and suffered massive storm damage. And the ground floor of that house was where my bedroom and my walk-in robe was, and that was the area of the house that sustained the most damage. And we had to move out of the house, and I had to empty those rooms completely to allow for them to be restored. And when my parents had died quite a few years earlier, I'd packed up their house, and I'd packed up a box with memorabilia, and some of that memorabilia was letters and a few old photos, and I'd popped it into a box and then stored it at my home and never really looked at the box again. Of course, in the flood, everything got damaged, including this box. So I opened it up to check to see what was in it and to see whether the contents were okay. And when I pulled open the box, I saw the most amazing thing. And I'm actually, I have them here. I'm just going to reach down and just excuse me for a moment while I grab them. So this is not the actual box. This does belong to my mum, but this isn't the box that they were in because that was destroyed. But this is what I found in the box. I don't know if you can see that there. There's two bundles of these letters, and then some very gorgeous photos of my mum and dad. They're very hard to see, I think, on camera, but there are some really gorgeous photos of my parents in here. This is the particular one I want to show you because this photo was what helped inspire the beginning of the story. Anyway, so I found these letters, and the amazing thing about them is that they're love letters between my parents, almost equal amount from my mum to my dad and from my dad to my mum. So I put them in, I spent a couple of days reading through them and putting them in chronological order, sorting them all out. And then once I had them in proper order, I sat and just read them, and it was honestly like reading a book on its own. It was just such a beautiful love story, and started in 1961. My mum lived in Geelong and my dad lived in Lindenau, and so they'd had this chance meeting in Geelong and fallen in love. Well, had the beginnings of a love story, and they wrote to each other sometimes twice a day. Sometimes my dad would write in the morning and catch the morning post, and then he would write again in the afternoon. And what struck me about the letters that was interesting to me, not just the actual unfolding love story, but the historical detail. At one point, Mum talks about watching President Kennedy's funeral on TV and crying and being upset about that. And they talk about bands that they went to see. Mum went to see Cold Joy at one point, I think, and bands that she likes. They talk about the Beatles. It's a really interesting historical set of documents. And the other interesting thing to me was the language that they used, and also their personalities, because my mum, and I'll get to this bit in a minute, but my mum I saw as quite a strong woman, and she very much knew her own mind. She was quite a quietly confident person. But in these letters, she defers to my dad all the time, and at one point even says something like, well, when we get married, that will be your decision because after all, you're the boss, which is not something that I can ever imagine my mum saying in her later years. So they were a really interesting snapshot of that time and how men and women related to each other in that time, and how just how society has changed, and the societal expectations upon young women at that time in the early 1960s. Even though it was a time of change, in the beginning of that decade, particularly here in Australia, change was slow to come. So many of those 1950s values were still with us at that point in time. Anyway, so I read the letters, and then I realised that I could use these letters as an inspiration for the backstory to my elderly runaway couple. So I married the two stories, and here came the book. Now, I want to be careful here and say that Frank and Shirley are not my mum and dad, and their love story, I borrowed some of the details from the way they met, and some of the details from their lives. Like, for instance, the house that they move into is the house that my mum and dad moved into, albeit in a different place, because mum and dad lived in Melbourne, but I've transported them to Geelong, where my mum grew up, for the sake of the book. But yeah, Frank and Shirley have their own personalities, very much so. They are not my mum and dad, but I did draw a lot of inspiration from those lovely letters. And I guess Mum inspired me to write Shirley in a lot of ways, because my mum was very much a woman of her time. She was very much of that generation of women that sacrificed their own needs and wants for their husband and for their children. So my mum raised me to be strong, to be independent, to have a career and to be educated, and she was the single strongest driving force behind me finishing high school and going to university. She was my greatest encourager in terms of my writing, and did many things that helped me to become a writer, including believing in me, which is probably the most important ingredient, I think, is having people behind you that do believe in you, and my mum did. And eventually her belief in me translated to self-belief. So I don't think I would have become a writer without my mum. So it's interesting that she pushed me, her daughter, to do these things, whereas she herself was very much a homemaker and someone who sacrificed her own needs and wants for her family. And my mum died young. She died in her early 60s, and she never really got to realise any of her own dreams for herself. She was an incredibly creative woman, but she never really got to do anything or see her name on any one piece of art, or she didn't get to create anything that was just her own, or be remembered for being someone who wasn't just a wife or a mum or a grandmother. And so I think in Shirley Sullivan, Shirley herself grows up in the same era as my mother and is influenced by the same things, and spends the early part of her life and in fact quite a lot of her life doing the same things that my mum did, in terms of making sacrifices to make her family happy. But what I wanted to do with Shirley was show that if you live long enough, you can overcome that. So Shirley I gave her, I guess, the ending that I would hope for my mum in some ways, and I'm not going to give away the ending of the book, but just in terms of Shirley's character growth, even by the beginning of the book, when she's stealing Frank from the home, she's finally doing the things that she wants to do for herself, for her own reasons that are not influenced by anyone else. Anyway, so that's the story of The Secret Life of Shirley Sullivan and my mum's role in it. I really hope you enjoy the book, and I hope that those of you who are mums are having a wonderful Mother's Day. Thanks.